We recommend that the installation of the system be performed by a quality service center or professional muffler installer who has the necessary equipment, tools, and experienced personnel. However, if you decide to perform this install, the use of a hoist and an additional person will be required. This installation involves the removal of the lower rear fascia, followed by the removal of the stock axle back components. It also requires cutting and clamping onto the stock axle pipe section just after the factory active fuel management valve. The presence of the AFM valve in both NPP and non-NPP stock systems is needed to achieve the acoustic target while AFM is active. Caution: never work on a hot exhaust system. Allow time for the vehicle to cool. Please confirm that all parts are present before beginning installation. If something is missing, call tech support at 1-800-486-0999. If you are installing just the CORSA valve back system, then removing the factory xpipe isn't necessary. Remove the factory tunnel undershield. The shield is secured in place by 24 bolts, including 2 larger bolts near the front of the shield. Use an 18mm socket and 3/8" ratchet to remove the 2 larger bolts, followed by a 13mm socket and ratchet to remove the remaining 22 bolts. Remove the 2 bolts securing the X-pipe hanger grommet with a 13mm socket, a 3/8" ratchet, and a small extension. This will allow the factory X-pipe section to droop. Set aside these bolts to be reused during the installation process. Loosen the clamp bolts at the X-pipe outlet using a 15mm socket and a 3/8" ratchet. Remove the 4 bolts that secure the factory X-pipe inlet flanges using a 15mm socket and a 3/8" ratchet. Carefully pivot the stock X-pipe section down at the inlet flanges and then forwards to free it from the vehicle. Carefully remove both of the factory donut gaskets using a small flathead screwdriver. Set aside the donut gaskets to be reused during installation. Remove the hanger grommet from the 2 hangers using grommet pullers or a similar device. Set aside the grommet to be reused during installation. Using a soap and water solution may make working with the rubber grommets easier. Remove the 2 bolts above the tip location using a 10mm socket and 3/8" ratchet. Remove the 10 bolts that secure the bottom corners of the lower fascia, 5 per side, using a 7mm socket and 1/4" ratchet. Remove the 2 lower mesh inserts on each side of the lower fascia. Each one is snapped in place using 6 tabs, which can be pushed out from the inside of the fascia. Unsnap each lower corner of the fascia by pushing the end of the tab inward, while pushing the fascia up and then backwards. Unscrew and remove the license plate to enable access to the 2 upper center mounting bolts. Carefully remove the 2 reflectors on each side. The reflectors are snapped in place using 3 tabs, which can be pushed out from the inside of the fascia. Remove the 6 bolts that secure the top of the fascia, 2 on each side and 2 in the center, using a 10mm socket and 3/8" ratchet. Carefully unsnap each tab securing the top corners to remove the fascia, and set it aside in a safe location. If you have an NPP exhaust, disconnect the rear non-AFM valve wire. Remove the 2 bolts holding the stock mufflers together using a 10mm socket and 3/8" ratchet. Remove the 2 bolts securing the rear muffler grommet with a 13mm socket and a 3/8" ratchet. Set aside the bolts to be reused for installation. Disconnect the AFM valve wire on the passenger side, then carefully pivot the stock exhaust section down and rearwards to free it from the vehicle. Disconnect the AFM valve wire on the driver's side. Manual transmission vehicles can now remove the stock exhaust. Automatic transmission vehicles. The shift linkage on the driver's side has to be moved to create enough clearance to remove the stock exhaust. This can be done by putting the car in neutral while the driver's side is being removed, or by manually pushing it out of the way. Remove both of the factory valve control units to protect them during the cutting process. Remove the 3 screws securing each of the control units using an 8mm socket and 1/4" ratchet. Remove the hanger grommet from each rear muffler using grommet pullers or similar device. Set aside both grommets to be reused during the installation process. Use the supplied driver and passenger side cutting templates to mark the cut line on each of the stock muffler sections. Double check that the proper tool is being used on each side, as the AFM valve on the passenger side is closer to the muffler than the one on the driver's side. The tools are to be positioned against the downstream weld edge of the AFM valves, which is between the valve and the muffler. Mark along the labeled edge to create a cut line. Using a saw or chain-style pipe cutter, cut each pipe at the mark. The cut should be as close to parallel to the edge of the valve as possible. Deburr the cut edge of the retained factory pipe using a file or sanding device. Mark the center of the valve on both driver and passenger side axle pipes for an alignment reference to use during installation. Locate the driver side D-etch and passenger side P-etch clamp on elbow assemblies along with the driver and passenger side trimmed factory axle pipes retained from the last step in the removal process. Remember, the AFM valve on the passenger side axle pipe is closer to the cut position than the driver side. Using the D and P etches, match the driver D and passenger P clamp on elbows to the correct axle pipes before proceeding. Apply the supplied anti-seize lubricant only to the threads of all clamps. Failure to follow this procedure can cause nuts to seize on clamps and potentially destroy threads. After applying, be sure to thoroughly clean your hands. The lubricant will tarnish stainless steel. When tightening clamps, use a properly calibrated torque wrench. Using an air impact gun will damage the clamp and reduce its ability to effectively seal the joint. It may also cause the joint to separate and damage your exhaust system and vehicle. Align all clamps so that the center of the clamp bolt is 90 degrees from the notch in the pipe as pictured below. Slide the passenger side P-etch clamp on elbow assembly onto the trimmed passenger side axle pipe until the edge of the clamp is just short of contacting the downstream weld edge of the AFM valve. Rotate the elbow until the alignment arrow is pointing at the mark made earlier on the center of the valve. Hold the elbow in position and tighten the clamp bolt. Torque to 45 foot-pounds. Do not over-torque the clamp bolts. It can cause distortion to the outlet end of the elbows, which can make the muffler installation difficult. Using a tape measure, mark the trimmed driver side axle pipe at 1 1/8 inch from the cut position. This mark is where you will slide the elbow up to. Slide the driver side D-etch clamp on elbow onto the trimmed driver side axle pipe up to the mark you just made, not the weld. Rotate the elbow until the alignment arrow is pointing at the mark made earlier on the center of the valve. Hold the elbow in position and tighten the clamp bolt. Torque to 45 foot-pounds. Reinstall the factory valve control units using an 8mm socket and 1/4 inch ratchet. Insert the CORSA xpipe hangers into the factory rubber grommet. The mounting bracket and the grommet must be oriented as shown, with the mounting holes facing forward and favoring the top of the assembly. Slide the factory donut gaskets onto the CORSA xpipe inlet until they are seated against the flanges. Install each axle pipe back into the chassis. Make sure to reconnect the AFM valve wire. Place the two 2 3/4 inch clamps over the outlets of the CORSA xpipe assembly, with the clamp bolts on the outside facing downward. Slide the outlet end of the xpipe onto the axle pipes. Align the other end with the stock mounting flanges. You may want to support the assembly with a jack stand or similar device. Align the stock flanges and install the hardware with the M10 nuts on the downstream side of the connection. Leave the hardware loose at this point. Install the 2 bolts to mount the xpipe hanger grommet. Make sure the mounting bracket is centered, then secure with a 13mm socket and 3/8 inch ratchet. At this time, remove any under supports. Tighten the 4 sets of M10 nuts to secure the factory xpipe inlet flanges using a 15mm socket and 3/8 inch ratchet. Alternate tightening each side to keep the xpipe assembly centered in the cavity. Verify that the assembly is centered by checking the clearances to the transmission and the xpipe outlet. There should be at least a fingertip worth of clearance on both sides. Torque fasteners to 31 foot-pounds. Slide the axle pipe into the xpipe section as far as possible. The locating tabs of the factory axle pipe will contact the xpipe outlet edges. Rotate the axle pipe until it is centered between the chassis and the transmission components. Tighten the clamp bolts at the xpipe outlet using a 15mm socket and 3/8 inch ratchet. Torque bolts to 45 foot-pounds. Reinstall each of the rear muffler hanger grommets as shown using a 13mm socket and 3/8 inch ratchet. Tuck each of the rear non-AFM valve wires into the chassis. They will no longer be needed. Secure with a zip tie or equivalent. Hold the driver's side muffler case with the seam pointed up. Position one of the 2 3/4 inch clamps so that the clamp bolt is pointing toward the bracket side, inside of the muffler, and the nut is towards the ground. The driver's side muffler needs to be installed first because the passenger side tie bracket will nest inside of the driver's side bracket. Insert the driver's side hanger into the rubber grommet and the muffler inlet over the clamp on elbow. Insert the passenger side hanger into the rubber grommet and the muffler inlet over the clamp on elbow. Secure the clamps with a 15mm socket and a 3/8 inch ratchet and a long extension, leaving it loose enough for further adjustment. Locate the tie bracket hardware: 2 M8 flange bolts, 2 lock washers, the half-round spacer, and the 2 M8 serrated flange nuts. Assemble the lock washers onto the M8 flange bolts as shown. The lock washer must go on the flange bolt side to function properly. The serrations on the flange nut will provide the locking feature on the opposite side. Rotate the rear mufflers upwards until the hole sets align in the muffler tie brackets. Load the 2 M8 flange bolts and lock washers in from the front. Place the half-round spacer onto the bolts from the back side so it sits inside the V shape of the passenger side tie bracket. Hand tighten the M8 flange nuts onto the half-round spacer as shown to finish the connection. Make sure the lower step on the passenger side tie bracket is fully inside of the channel made by the driver's side bracket. Reinstall the rear fascia onto the vehicle. Carefully align each of the locating tabs along the top edge of the rear fascia. Snap the 2 corner tabs into place. Reinstall the 6 bolts to secure the top of the lower fascia, 2 on each side and 2 in center, using a 10mm socket and 3/8 inch ratchet. Reinstall the 2 bolts above the tip location using a 10mm socket and a 3/8 inch ratchet. Reinstall the 2 lower mesh inserts on each side by snapping them back in place. It is easier to snap the inner tabs in place before the outer tabs. Reinstall the 2 reflectors on each side by snapping them back in place. Reinstall the 10 bolts that secure the bottom corners of the lower fascia, 5 per side, using a 7mm socket and 1/4 inch ratchet. Align both 2 3/4 inch clamps on the CORSA tip inlets. The clamp bolts lean to the inside and the clamp nuts face downwards. Carefully insert the tip assembly into the cutout in the rear valence and align the tip assembly inlet with both muffler outlets. Adjust the position and depth of the tip assembly until it is centered in the cutout and has equal amount of reveal on each side. Then snug the clamps using a 15mm socket and a 3/8 inch ratchet, leaving them loose enough for further adjustment. Adjust the system accordingly to maximize chassis clearance while positioning the tip assembly within the bumper valence. Verify that the valved axle pipe assemblies are not contacting anything within the chassis. Starting at the front and working backwards, tighten the clamps to 45 foot-pounds using the torque wrench and 15mm socket. Ensure that the tips are still in the desired position. Tighten the muffler tie bracket hardware at this time using a 13mm wrench along with a 13mm socket and 3/8 inch extension. Torque to 15 foot-pounds. Reinstall the factory tunnel undershield. Secure in place with 24 bolts set aside during removal. Using an 18mm socket and 3/8 inch ratchet to tighten the 2 larger bolts, followed by a 13mm socket and ratchet to tighten the remaining 22 bolts. Torque undershield bolts to factory specs. During cold weather startups, you may experience an exhaust sound that is deeper and louder in tone than usual. This is temporary and will diminish to normal levels once your engine has reached its normal operating temperature. Immediately following the installation of your exhaust system, you may experience a trace of smoke after initial startup. Do not be alarmed. The smoke is caused by the burning of a small amount of forming oil residue used in the manufacturing process.